Hallo and welcome to Gegenpressing, the Bundesliga podcast. I'm Manu and he is Stefan Bienkowski. It's almost the end of the week and this is our preview show. Stefan, how's it going? How are you hanging in there throughout this week of no German football, no European football, a little bit of English football? Feels like it's a really quiet, nice transition week from Easter to whatever comes next.
Yeah, some might say nice, some might say boring. I found it quite boring, to be perfectly honest with you. It's a tough news week when Oliver Burke's making all the headlines, which we'll definitely come on to later on.
It's a great guy.
But yeah, we're definitely kind of approaching that point of the season where a lot of the clubs have kind of had things decided. The relegation teams are more or less decided. Still have the playoff spot, obviously. Zweite Bundesliga is trying its best to kind of make up for things by sacking head coaches left, right, and centre. We lost, 3 head coaches this weekend, I think?
Madness. Absolute madness. Markus Anfang sacked. Schalke sacked the head coach. Hannover sacked their head coach. It's just wild.
Yeah. And Hamburg having a bit of a hiccup. I was chatting to one of our HSV fans in our company today, our company we work for, rather, this week, and I was kind of joking with him about them kind of tripping up and stuff, and he says he's absolutely petrified because they've got like basically the 4 games left, and it's probably 4 against some really pretty crap opposition. I think the highest ranked team is still got to play, or maybe like 13th or something in the league, and he was like, no, this is terrible for us because he's like, Hamburg played better against the best teams. It's these little teams that we struggle against. And I was like, you realize that the stars are all aligning for like a nightmare scenario for HSV where St. Pauli obviously stay up, Werder Bremen get into the Champions League, and then HSV trip up and once again fail to win promotion. So,
I mean, if that happens, then we might as well just dissolve the club and merge them with St. Pauli and just turn it into a downtown team.
Yeah, so that's the kind of week I've been having. I've had to go out of my way to go wind up Hamburg fans. So looking forward to the football returning and some entertainment for me.
If you want to know what you're playing, they're playing Darmstadt. So that's a pretty good opponent by Zweite Bundesliga standards. They have been in the Bundesliga in that period that HSV have not. Ulm on matchday 33. And then
relegated.
Were already relegated. And then they're seeing out the season against Fürth.
Who I think are like mid-table.
Yes, they are mid-table, but there's that history, of course, that that's where they stayed in against the year before they were finally relegated, right? That last-minute free kick by Argentine midfielder who saved them. And of course, HSV play Karlsruhe this week, who also, they're still in that hunt. So that the schedule is actually not as easy as people make it out to be. Karlsruhe are only 4 points out from a promotion spot. So, having said that, half the league is 4 points out from a promotion spot. So, what do I know? Maybe next week we can park some time for the second division because it is wild and it's really interesting. And yeah, I mean, the nerves are out there, and Kaiserslautern firing Anfang. I think the reason behind that, though, is that he may have taken a job elsewhere. There's some talk that he's already committed to signing for Schalke next summer, and then Kaiserslautern were, well, if you don't want to be here, then goodbye, which is fair. Hannover, we talked about midweek, Matt and I. The disaster of a club that is, and if you want to have a bit more on that, you check out the bonus show. But yeah, as I said, the Zweite Bundesliga is insane as ever. Magdeburg and Elversberg in the promotion race too. I wrote about Elversberg this week. Magdeburg is another interesting club. 1972 cup winner, the only team from the GDR to win an international trophy. They could go up. And actually, you know what? I would classify them as a big club, Stefan, if they go up. That's a 30,000 seat stadium in a club with a lot of history that have not been in the Bundesliga ever since reunification. And if they go up, I think they would actually add something really significant to the league. So I add them to the big club list. But yeah, I mean, it's wild, and we should probably park some time for it next week because the Bundesliga, increasingly, a lot of the major decisions are made, as you said. relegation race. We know that who the teams are that going down. We just don't know who's going down directly. Heidenheim, Bochum, and Kiel are playing for that promotion relegation spot. It's 8 points from them to Hoffenheim and St. Pauli. I think that's too much for 4 games. I just can't see Heidenheim making up that gap. The title race also 8 points, so that's decided in my opinion. But then it gets interesting. The Champions League race is completely wide open. From Bremen, who we're going to talk about later, to all the way up to Frankfurt. I think all these teams are still fully in it. Frankfurt may be a little bit separate, but Frankfurt have a really big game against Leipzig, and there's a lot of noise around Leipzig, who's going to be the next head coach. A big match for both these teams. I think if Frankfurt win that game at home against Leipzig, they can book their ticket to the Champions League. But, for Leipzig, this is a must-win because they have that chasing pack right behind them.
Yeah, it's probably one of the most interesting games of the weekend, actually, because, it's, as you said, it's 2 teams kind of fighting for top 4. Frankfurt have really kind of, I don't know, they've kind of wobbled a wee bit, I think, especially in the second half of the season. I know they beat Heidenheim recently and picked up wins over Stuttgart and Bochum, but they obviously drew against Augsburg at the weekend there, which wasn't entirely surprising, although I did expect goals in that game. But they've lost to Werder Bremen as well. They lost to Union Berlin, Leverkusen, Bayern, dropped points to Gladbach, Wolfsburg, Hoffenheim since the start of the 2025. And it just feels like they're exhausted. We talked about them, I guess it was last week on the previous show, I guess, a little bit, after the Tottenham game. It knocked them out of the Europa League, and yeah, they just kind of look like they're just desperately waiting to get to the end of the season. But they're going to have to really kind of roll up their sleeves and kind of make sure they can get to the end of the season, because they've got 4 kind of almost kind of playoff games, if you will, or one-off matches. They've also got Leipzig, which is a big game in the top 4. They then play Mainz, another big team who are trying to finish in the top 4. St. Pauli, who are obviously desperate for points and doing quite well in recent weeks. And then they finish up away to Freiburg, who will potentially be kind of obviously still in the hunt for a European spot, even in the final match day. So Frankfurt will not be able to kind of put their feet up and kind of start booking their summer holidays until the final whistle has been blown. But yeah, they play a really tough Leipzig side who've looked a little bit better in recent weeks. Obviously, under a new head coach in Löw, the interim head coach.
Yeah.
He's going to change things a wee bit. He's kind of moved back to kind of 4-4-2. And they've been picking up points. They beat Hoffenheim, beat Wolfsburg, drew 1-1 with Holstein Kiel, which didn't surprise me a huge amount, to be honest with you. But it just kind of feels like Löw's just kind of gone back to basics with this Leipzig team, and it's kind of suited them quite well. And both teams will be kind of gunning for a win here, so I think it'll be a really interesting match. But there's so much to talk about with Leipzig right now, Manu, over and above this match.
Yeah, there really is. Maybe the one thing I want to talk about before we do that, want to really quickly touch on something that we mentioned on Frankfurt last week, and I think it is still to be true, right? A lot really does depend on whether Mario Götze can be back for them. I think without him, they really struggle for attacking ideas. That was the problem against Tottenham, was the problem last week as well. So, I think that is something to keep in mind. But Leipzig, they have the Wings Cup right now in Leipzig, a youth tournament, a really big youth tournament. And so there's lots of panel discussions. I think Arsene Wenger was there, David Wagner was there. Jürgen Klopp spoke to the media today a lot about talent development and how the club themselves can improve talent development. And it's a big topic, and it's a big topic that we've discussed on the show because they haven't really developed a player that is playing for them from their own academy. Obviously they're pointing to players that have made it elsewhere. Demirovic is an example. Remind me the kid that's now playing in at Celtic, quite a good player. He was, I think, with their academy as well for some time. I'm completely blanking on him. He was with Bayern and he was with Leipzig.
Yeah, me too, actually. Have I forgot his name already?
He did really well in the Champions League for them.
I'll have it to you in 10 seconds. It's definitely not Arnie Engels. It is Niklas Kühn.
Niklas Kühn. Yeah, I think he was in the setup, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And so, they like to point at players that have been in their setup and have now done well elsewhere, but they have not really gotten one through to their first team. I think Vigo Geibel could be the first. Uedraogo they're pointing to, but like he really was developed by Schalke, wasn't he? So there's a lot of talk about that, but like really the most pressing issue at Leipzig is the head coach search, right? And there's been names that have been leaked. Thierry Henry is one that came out of nowhere today, and I think that's because he was in the Red Bull Cosmos, right? He played for New York Red Bulls, coached over in MLS as well. I can guarantee you that's not going to happen. He's not necessarily on their list. I think he's a name that they would like to get involved in a similar fashion. Mario Gomez is involved right now, but he's not someone for the head coaching role. Cesc Fabregas is someone who they really like and would really like to get, but I think this was reported elsewhere by Fabrizio Romano and Guido Schäfer. They did a podcast together. It's a caught offside, I think, Stefan, that they did it on, where Fabrizio Romano said, "You're shaking your head." I don't know either. I just read this, to be honest with you. I know that Guido Schäfer is really, really well connected with an RB Leipzig. So I trust him when he says that they want Cesc Fabregas. And then, of course, Fabrizio Romano is very well connected in Italian football. So I trust him if he says that Como doesn't necessarily want him to let go. So RB Leipzig, I think, can dream in this category. They would like to have him as a head coach, but it sounds like that's extremely difficult. Maybe the Jurgen Klopp factor can do something here, but maybe not. So I would put this on the extremely maybe. And then the other name is Oliver Glasner. Again, a coach with an RB Leipzig, Red Bull past, Austrian, just doing a pretty good job with Crystal Palace in the Premier League. Not cheap. Bayern Munich tried to get him last year, right? I think they were quoted 20 million euros to sign him. That's a lot of cash for a coach. I've been told Leipzig would like to negotiate that price down. I'm probably just helping them negotiating right now by saying this, because that's how clubs do it, right? They're like, oh, we would like to pay 10 million euros. And it's like, well, this is just how it goes, right? They will tell us a figure. And I think when push comes to shove, an agreement could be found, but it kind of highlights that this isn't an easy thing. And I know Jurgen Klopp and Marcel Schäfer talk about this all the time. This is the most important position within the Red Bull empire. So there's a lot of people involved, and this is where we're at. And finally, Scholt Löw. Openda spoke out about him and said that he's a coach that we really like, and the players really like working with him. Although caution here, they also really like working with Marco Rose, and I actually think that the players maybe need someone who kicks them in the butt a little bit, because this is a very talented group, and they're a little soft mentally at times, and I think they probably need someone who can sharpen the senses a little bit. So I'm not sure if the players agree like a coach, whether that's a direction that I would go as a club. Having said that, Scholt Löw is a really interesting candidate. Played under Jurgen Klopp at Mainz, then played under Rangnick at Hoffenheim, worked with Thomas Tuchel at a bunch of different clubs, worked with Julian Nagelsmann at Hoffenheim, and was in the Red Bull system as an assistant coach as well. So this is a guy, when you look at it, and it's actually a very similar kind of pathway to becoming a potential head coach than the guy who's on the opposite touchline, and that's Dino Topmüller, who has done really well as a head coach since making the jump from assistant to head coach. So this is, at first I'm like, oh, this is a boring choice, but actually when you look at his CV, could be a really interesting choice for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head there, to be perfectly honest with you. He brings with him actually a surprising amount of coaching pedigree, having worked under so many different head coaches. And played under so many as well. And there's a few factors here that I think we have to kind of consider. I think the first one is that the candidates that they've been linked with so far are, in my opinion, entirely underwhelming. Thierry Henry is a pundit. He makes his, he enjoys being on CBS every week, making jokes with Mika Richards and Jimmy Carragher talking about the Champions League. That seems to be where he enjoys being, where he is. I know he has got a kind of fledgling coaching career. He was obviously at Belgium for a while, and I'm sure he knows exactly what he's doing on a training pitch. But in terms of his actual ability today as a head coach, it's pretty underwhelming. Says Fabregas as well, another fledgling head coach. By all means, could prove to be a very good head coach in time. Xabi Alonso obviously arrived at Leverkusen with very little to his CV as well, aside from kind of youth coach stuff and some first team football. So it's not to say these guys can't go on to do something, but they don't bring with them a huge amount of history or a long CV, shall we say. And the Oliver Glasner one's really interesting to me because I think, as you said, it seems unlikely for a few reasons. Number one, I think Crystal Palace would move heaven and earth to keep Oliver Glasner this summer, to be honest with you, and they would make Leipzig pay through the nose for him. And the interesting thing about the Glasner reports is that for much of this season, before Marco Rose lost his job, we were hearing a lot about how Glasner wants to return to Leipzig in a non-coaching role. Consistent reports linking Glasner with him return to the club as like a head of recruitment or head of strategy or whatever. Leipzig seem to have about 20 of these roles at the club that they just kind of hand out to ex-players just to kind of do something there. They almost be kind of bumping into each other in empty rooms at the Red Bull Arena. But yeah, I think it's a little suspicious that there was consistent reports linking Glasner to return to the club in a non-coaching role, in an administrative role. And then once Marco Rose gets sacked, it's like, oh, well, actually, he's also in the running for the head coach role. I'm like, well, that doesn't really line up to me. But anyway, who knows? I think Glasner would be fantastic for Leipzig, but I just don't think it's going to happen. And it just kind of leads me to think that there's something entirely underwhelming about the kind of list of candidates that have been linked with the RB Leipzig job. And it's a little similar to when we had that conversation about who Dortmund replaced Nuri Sahin with. And, there's a number of kind of interesting candidates suggested. And then we all sat down and said, well, we obviously know it's going to be some sort of Bundesliga adjacent personality. It has to be some guy who can speak German and speak to the local
Why?
newspaper.
No one in the squad speaks German.
Yeah, well, and I mean, to be fair, I don't think that's the case with Leipzig, to be honest. But Leipzig have their own kind of limitations in the sense that they always try to go for these kind of Red Bull adjacent guys. And the really interesting thing I think about the Red Bull operation is that you can point to a number of players who've obviously done well at Salzburg, have done well at RB Leipzig, or perhaps even beginning to do well at the other sister clubs in America or the US and South America and things like that. But I think you'd really, really, really struggle to point to a head coach who's came through the Red Bull system, came through at Leipzig or Salzburg, and gone on to become a world-class head coach. And some people might be listening to this right now and saying, well, what about Julian Nagelsmann? And I would say Julian Nagelsmann is a Hoffenheim prospect. That's where he learned his trade.
1860 in the youth academy.
Okay, fine, 1860.
No, but it's true. Like, that's where he started. He was not touched by Red Bull or Hoffenheim until very late.
Oh, no, yeah, of course, yeah. But the point is, I'm saying he's not a Red Bull guy.
Yeah.
Neither is Hasenhüttl. I think, has gone on to do a good job as well in his career. Although right now his stock's maybe not fantastic, but it just seems to be something that Leipzig kind of trip up over and over again. Marco Rose, decent Bundesliga head coach, but I wouldn't say did a terrible job at Dortmund because I'm a little sympathetic to the situation he was in there, but by no means did great. Did an okay job at Gladbach, obviously started off very well, and that kind of really tailed off, and by the time he left, his stock was an all-time low. Domenico Tedesco, again, another head coach who wasn't exactly pulling up tree trunks in the Bundesliga or in German football in general. Jesse Marsch, complete risky option. I'm sorry, US or even now Canada soccer fans listen to this, but complete whiff with that appointment, to be perfectly honest with you.
I think the problem with Jesse is, just to intersect here, because I think he is a typical national team coach. He does really well when he works with a group at a limited time, but I think, taking a Bundesliga club, and especially after Nagelsmann, is just way too big of a step. Yeah.
But the thing is, like with Nagelsmann, they struck gold there. Yeah. But there was nothing to suggest that he would work out there. It's the same, I guess, a wee bit with Hasenhüttl, who came from Ingolstadt, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. They plucked both of these guys from relatively nowhere and gave them the positions. And now Hasenhüttl, maybe it was a little easier because there wasn't a huge amount of expectation to RB Leipzig back then because they were just kind of coming into the league and no one really knew. I mean, everyone hated them, so no one was really going to put much pressure on to be winning league titles. But he did a good job there, and then obviously Nagelsmann did a tremendous job at Leipzig. But I find it weird that they keep thinking let's just appoint these nobodies that they do keep appointing to a relative degree, and hoping that one of them will just kind of become the next Julian Nagelsmann. And it's similar to the kind of Dortmund conundrum where I'm like, these clubs are never going to become serious contenders for league titles or in the Champions League, in which I know it's silly to say because Dortmund were just in the Champions League final, but consistently and making the most of the squads that they have, if they're going to kind of really limit the scope of which head coaches they're going to bring to the club. And I think the names that have been linked to the Leipzig job so far underline just how limited that club's ambition is.
I mean, there's some interesting names I think out there that they should consider. I mentioned earlier this week that Blazin, for example.
There's this great website, Manu, you can go to called
Transfermarkt. Yeah, sure.
And they have a whole page called Available Coaches.
No. I'm actually talking about coaches who are not available or are currently in a job. One name that I think is fascinating is Kwasniok from Paderborn. He's going to leave the club at the end of the season. He's been linked to the Leverkusen job. He's been linked to, was linked to the Stuttgart job until Sebastian Hoeneß extended his contract there. Interesting name because he comes from a completely different environment, which I think would do the club well. Roger Schmidt is being increasingly linked with the RB Leipzig job as well. I think this is a candidate that they have to wait on because he's technically under contract with Benfica, right? So they would have to pay a big fee. But I actually wouldn't be surprised if it was someone that we don't even have on the radar yet, or if it is Scholdlöw at the end of the day. I think it's a really difficult decision because the club can't really plan or make any major decisions until they know where they're going to play next year. I've been told that budget-wise, there's a big difference for them whether they play Champions League or Europa League, right? And which players they're going to be able to keep and which players they can't keep. The whole Harvey Simmons question, for example, Harvey Simmons changed his agents this week. We all know what that means. Yeah, I think they're in just a really difficult transition moment, and because they are in this difficult transition moment, and it's a very big decision because this time it has to work, right? They went through, as you said, after Nagelsmann left, they went through Marsch, Tedesco, and Rose, right? In quick succession, a relatively quick succession. And I think Marco Rose, in many ways, was the perfect coach for this club because he gave them sort of this local kind of flavor. The players loved him. I mean, the interactions I've had with him, he's a great human being. But I think at the end of the day, he was just too nice. They need someone like him who can maybe not be too nice to the players. I think sometimes I get the sense that things are just a little bit too comfortable in Leipzig. They have this great facility. They have this great stadium. It's a wonderful city. It's actually one of the most livable cities in Germany. And I think sometimes it's just all a bit too nice, Stefan. They need someone who makes things a little bit too uncomfortable. They have this... On the training ground, they have this hill that Magath used to have in Wolfsburg, the famous hill that the players had to run up to. They need a coach who makes them use that hill a little bit more often. I'm not saying Felix Magath, but someone who's empathetic, but also is not afraid of making really difficult decisions with the player personnel.
Yeah. Maybe not as bad as Magath, who used to wait till they got to the top of the hill and pour all the water bottles out. So when they got back, they had no water left.
It's a very 1970s Soviet Union approach, isn't it?
Absolutely. I was actually just looking at which head coaches are available and which ones have kind of lost their job in the last 12 months. And there are some interesting names there. Top of the list is actually Erik ten Hag, who was also linked with the Dortmund job. People might be raising an eyebrow at that, but of course he actually started his career as a youth coach in Bayern Munich. So he does know German football quite well. He was actually at Bayern Munich under Pep Guardiola. So he knows the Bundesliga to an extent.
And
obviously
also almost ended up at the Dortmund job if there hadn't been that big transfer fee.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess that fee might still be applicable, but
Yeah.
there's a name there. One that I think would be really interesting is Motta, who just left Juventus. Didn't do a great job there, but did a really good job at Bologna the year before. I think you'll get picked up very quickly, but really impressive attacking football. I think he'd do a great job there. Here's one that's interesting: Edin Terzic. Now, would Terzic, the champion of the Yellow Wall, take up a job with Leipzig? You would typically say no, but here we are with Jurgen Klopp walking around with the Leipzig blazer on, talking about youth football, the ECA this week. So never say never in that regard, I suppose. And there's plenty of other names there as well. I'm just quickly checking. I've actually just accidentally filtered them out, but Thiago Motta is the obvious one. Lopetegui, who just left West Ham, did a terrible job there, but he's still a decent head coach to an extent. Pauli, the Italian head coach. There's a lot of kind of interesting head coaches there who would bring a really interesting kind of tactical approach to Leipzig. And, I'm not just saying kind of throw money at some random head coach who doesn't understand German football or anything like that. I think these guys all know what they're doing. They're all professionals, especially someone like Edin Terzic. But I don't know. It just kind of it's just quite underwhelming. And I've kind of wrote quite a lot extensively about Leipzig as an organisation over the years, and from a sporting point of view. And I always do keep coming back to this unfortunate fact that they just kind of seem to lack the ambition of a football club that actually want to win anything, which really stands in direct contrast to the likes of their F1 team or what you see on social media, where they obviously spend a lot of money supporting and bankrolling all these extreme sports, where they're really, all these aspects of sport where they're pushing the limit, where the Leipzig club just seems to be, let's get to the top four, let's sell a few players, let's make another 100 million euros and start from scratch again. And I think that's been summed up by these head coaches, but we'll see what happens, I suppose.
Yeah, no, it's definitely an interesting topic, and it's going to be interesting to see where they're going to end up in their coaching search. To be determined, I've been told. when I poked a little bit more. All right, cool. Let's go to the Sunday game. Big derby. Bremen against Hamburg. Werder Bremen against St. Pauli. St. Pauli, of course, Hamburg's number one team now. Especially in this recent HSV meltdown. I'm kidding, HSV fans. You'll be fine. You're going up this year. I stuck my neck out the window and said in an article on the Substack earlier, a couple months ago, this year is the year it's going to happen. HSV are going up. I still believe that to be the case. Werder Bremen, wild. Absolutely wild. What is it? 4 points within Europe? Is it 5 or 4? Let me just
It was 4 when I checked last week.
Yes, it is 4 points. That is just, it's crazy. It's really 5 points though, because the goal differential is, they have a -6 goal differential. So it takes a 5 point swing. Let's say it that way. Just a crazy story. 4 games, the last 4 games, they won all of them. I've been told to do a quick hit on Oliver Burke for Forbes, so I looked into that a little bit. And when I wrote about him, guess what I found, Stefan? I found an article from 2017 where a certain young up-and-coming journalist from Bonn flew all the way to Leipzig to interview Oliver Burke for the BBC. And I'm like, that's a really great article. We wrote it, and I'm looking, oh, I know the guy. It's Stefan Bienkowski.
Yeah. Back when I worked for reputable outlets, I sat down with him and spoke to him when he first joined Leipzig. He was such high hopes. The nation of Scotland had such high hopes for him, even though he's from Nottingham, so he's not actually Scottish. But he still counts himself as Scottish. I don't mean it that way. I just mean he's got an English accent and has always lived in England. But that's fine. He is a lovely guy. I think I can still remember watching the training. Before that, and he just looked entirely lost. And then obviously Hasenhüttl came out with that really infamous line, which has kind of plagued his career, really, where he said he had an empty hard drive. And I think what he meant by that was that Well, I know what he meant by that. He meant he just never came through a system where he learned how to counter press properly and how to be a kind of team player. And that's kind of because Burke really kind of kicked off, and he was kind of like this teenage, sensation. Really, it came through at Nottingham, and he's never really actually had an opportunity to develop as a kind of normal player. He's played for an incredible amount of clubs, from Alaves to Millwall to Leipzig to West Brom to Celtic to now to Werder Bremen, and now obviously going off to Union Berlin. He's probably, that passport of his has probably got more stamps in it than just about anyone else.
And that is not his real passport. That's just his player passport.
There we go, fine. Then I'll say his wife then probably who has the normal passport. Shars will have all sorts of stamps on it. But yeah, he's off to Union Berlin, isn't he, Manu?
Well, that's the word. Werder Bremen have confirmed that he's going to leave, right? Because he's not going to renew his contract. I think you mentioned his wife is vegan and wanted a different lifestyle. If you're vegetarian or vegan, Berlin is it for you. That's the Swabian alternative food capital of the world. It's I personally think that there's something really interesting here because I think Oliver Burke is a player that has always fascinated me. He falls into a category at a time when Leipzig signed a few players that ended up being extremely talented, but for one way or another needed a different path to get there, which tells you quite a lot about their ability to really scout these players. I mean, another guy who's really in the news a lot and might end up back in German football is Ademola Lookman, right? Who they signed as well and just wasn't a great fit. But, ultimately we all know he's extremely talented. And I think Oliver Burke falls into that category too. He's now 28. He's probably playing his most mature football to this date. He broke Werder Bremen's speed record this last match day. He was clocked at 36.72 kilometers an hour. That's really fast. That's really fast.
Player.
A very fast player. And he just seems a little bit more intelligent on the field. It's always been the decision making that's kind of held him off. I remember when he first match he came on for Leipzig, right? He scored that winner against Dortmund. And it was off who's the other former Leipzig player who ended up in Liverpool and now is Kita. He gave the assist at that goal at the time, right? Speaking of really talented players that just didn't work out elsewhere. And in the last 4 games, he scored 3 goals. You can tell that there is something there. Ole Werner is getting the most out of him as a player. And yet, I can see him going to Union Berlin and really making next step in his career, 28, 29. He's finally showing the maturity that has been maybe lacking in the past. And I kind of was thinking about that what that maybe says about Werder Bremen, because last year they had a similar player who kind of broke through there in Nick Woltemade, right? Nick Woltemade ended up leaving the club, going to Stuttgart, where he's now one of the most sought-after talents in German football, maybe European football, period. And it kind of shows you that Werder Bremen are good at identifying these players, giving them a platform to shine, but for one reason or another, they cannot hold on to them. And that is, I think, a big criticism that Ole Werner has faced, right? That some of the younger players that have gone there, that they maybe weren't able to keep them. There's a few other names that come to mind. Dingshi is one that opted to, when he was on loan at Heidenheim, opted not to go back. He exercised his exit clause and went to Freiburg instead. So this is a player that they also missed out on. So you kind of go through the list of players that have kind of said, okay, well, we don't really want to stay. And then you kind of not getting a really great track record, which is in such stark contrast to what is going on the field this season and last season too. They stabilized the club. Now they could play in Europe next year. There's other names there like Mitchell Weiser who have done really well and really done a great thing with their careers after really struggling early on. So it's not always this case, but it seems like there is something going on there that they're not able to always hold on to all the players that they want to hold on to.
Yeah, it's this kind of really interesting kind of juxtaposition with Werder Bremen, where on the one hand you have a club who are doing really impressively well on the pitch, You can look at the amount of money that Werder Bremen has spent, which is very little at all, and the leaps that they've taken under Ole Werner over the course of the last couple of years, not just get to promoted, but to also establish themselves in mid-table, and now just 4 points off the Champions League. You'd really struggle to find a German club that have kind of made those strides under one head coach over the last 3 or 4 seasons. And they absolutely should be applauded for that. But as you said, on the other hand, a lot of kind of younger players have moved on from the club. Oliver Burke's the most recent example of that. He's not a young player anymore, which terrifies me since I interviewed him when he was a young player at RB Leipzig. But you can completely understand why he is moving on, because up until like 5 or 6 games ago, he just wasn't getting match time or getting game time at Werder Bremen. And this is I think the kind of fault line at Werder Bremen. I think it's something that a lot of their fans kind of tussle with, in the sense that Werner, the head coach, does a really good job of getting results out of this team, and he's done very well, obviously, to get Werder Bremen to where they are in the Bundesliga. But he has his favourites. He doesn't change much at all. And that means that either a player who's joined the club recently, such as Oliver Burke, just can't really break into the team unless there's some serious injuries, or if you're a young player, Werner just continues to overlook them. And he's quite unorthodox from a Bundesliga point of view in that sense, where he doesn't really feel an obligation to play young players at Werder Bremen. And you can go through that whole team, and actually, you can look at the form table over the last kind of 5 or 6 games, and the return of Marco Friedel, 27 years old, and Nicholas Stark in the middle of the park, he's 30. At right back, they've got Mitchell Weiser, who's like his lieutenant there, of course. Bittencourt midfield as well. The other one as well is Romano Schmidt, who has done a tremendous job. He's really kind of come on the last kind of couple of weeks and done a great job. And then, of course, there's Marvin Duksch, who's the kind of talisman up front. That's a whole spine of that Werder Bremen team who Ole Werner will, march into hell with. He's so committed to those players. But it does mean that other players really struggle to kind of get into that team. Oliver Burke, the most obvious example of that, and that's why he has opted to leave Werder Bremen and he's gone off to Union Berlin, who, by any measure, are a team in a poorer situation than Bremen are in the Bundesliga right now. And Werder Bremen have made it very clear that they wanted to keep him. But he can quite honestly say, well, look, up until about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I wasn't getting game time, so I want to go somewhere where I'm going to play every week. And that's Burke's prerogative, and that's totally understandable. But equally, and I have spoken to Werder Bremen fans about this, and a lot of them are quite passionate about their criticism of Werner because he doesn't develop young players. But he's still in this job because he keeps winning games, and he plays a very attacking style of football. It picks them up points. They do well in the Bundesliga, as we said. At one point this season, they were obviously struggling. I can't remember how far they dropped down, but they're now 4 points off the Champions League spot. But interesting enough, Werner's doing that with a squad which I just checked there. It has the second highest average oldest age in the Bundesliga this season in terms of players that he used in the start 11. Only Bochum have a higher average age from their usual starting 11 this season. So that just shows the kind of football kind of players that Werner's using there, and why people might look from the outside at Werder Bremen and think, wow, their fans must be delighted with Ole Werner. And probably some of them are, and they should be. I think he's done a great job. But there are these kind of issues with the personnel. He doesn't play young players all that often. And guys like Oliver Burke come and go because they don't get game time.
Well, the other one that's like probably going to be a big topic soon is Keke Top, right? The young striker they signed from Schalke, and he gets like 10 minutes here, 5 minutes there. His actual minutes are not that great when I look at it in his stats for this season. 293 minutes over 18 games, scored 4 goals and 2 assists. So that's actually pretty good, right? But yeah, like that, there's another guy who's probably wanting more game time, and rather than giving him more game time, they signed Andre Silva on loan from Leipzig, right, in the winter. So that's a good example. They also brought in Abdenego Nankishi from 1860, who hasn't also not played very much. He's a 22-year-old talented left winger. So like the list kind of continues on young guys that come there and then kind of don't get the playing time that they expected to. And I think Werder fans too They have that little bit of impatience because a lot of them grew up in the 90s or early 2000s when the club was not only in the top four of German football, but was also winning Bundesliga titles, right? And they were playing, Werder Bremen played the sort of football that Leipzig is known for now. You know, there's a really aggressive, attractive football. They invented that in German football. They were always known for playing the best football in German football. And I think that is where a lot of the impatience comes from. When you talk to Werder fans, because they're like, hey, like, you know, look, we used to be like the most attractive club in German football. We were like from Bremen, by the way, wonderful town. And the stadium there, and I've mentioned this many times in the show, is one of the most beautiful in German football. Great brass box because you ride almost on level with the field, which is, I think, something that I personally really like too. But it's like, they just, despite the success, there seems to be a longing to a time when they were this attractive brand, right? And maybe getting into European football this year, which is a goal that they want to reach, is going to do that. But you do need chaotic players like Burke as well to get there and to kind of play this kind of brand of football. I've praised Ole Werner this year in a couple of articles that I wrote. I think he's a good head coach. He's getting great results, so it's really hard to criticize him for that. He's still very young, which is, I think, something that people forget because, you know, they look at him and he's like, oh, he's this experienced guy. He must be in his 40s. I think he's still in his 30s, to be quite honest with you. Yeah, he's 36, you know. He's 4 years younger than me. So what do I know? But I think that is maybe where the expectations are for his next step in his development. That the bosses at the club will say, okay, you got us to Europe now. That's great. That's another step in the club's development after you kept them in the league. Now you got us back to Europe. You're making us a bunch of money. Hey, but could we maybe play some of the kids? Like, that'd be kind of nice because we at some point might have to get to a position where we can sign guys, play them, develop them, and maybe then sell them to a bigger club for lots of money because we're not doing that at all.
Yeah, that's probably the next step that Bremen have to take. They have to kind of develop that kind of off the field kind of infrastructure to kind of obviously catch up with the likes of, you know, Frankfurt, Leipzig, the Dortmunds of this world and stuff. Even Gladbach to an extent as well with Stuttgart, who've done a great job of that. But yeah, we'll see how well they can do. The interesting thing about Werder Bremen is they could finish as high as third, but they could also finish as low as 13th. And, you know, those two positions are worlds apart, which is really interesting. And they do have, just going to bring it back to the football here, actually, before we wrap up. Like, they've got a really tough game against St. Pauli here, who've also been doing really well. But then they have to play Union Berlin, who are obviously have the wind in their sails. RB Leipzig, who we just spoke about, who are doing better under Löw. And then they finish up with Heidenheim. And Heidenheim, by that point, might actually be fighting for a spot in the playoffs to kind of save their season. So 4 tough games. And it's probably worth noting as well that the 4 games they have won recently, now they beat Leverkusen, which there's no qualms about it, a great result, but they beat Holstein Kiel, bottom of the league. Frankfurt, who, as we mentioned, are exhausted. Stuttgart, who've been absolutely dreadful in the second half of the season. And then, of course, they've beaten Bochum. So I'll be really interested to see how they do at home, where they're not typically very good, against a good St. Pauli side, who we had a lot of praise for last weekend. So these next 4 games, and where they end up finishing, whether it's 3rd or 13th, might decide how much praise Ole Werner ends up getting in the summer.
Yeah, and big game. Must tune in on a Sunday. I think a really great way of rounding up the match day, because it is a derby. It is Hamburg against Bremen in Bremen, of course. And so, yeah, I think it's really worthwhile tuning into this match. Stefan, let's wrap this up. Lots of Substacks on the side. I wrote mine on Elversberg. And then Matt and I did 2 deep dives as well. 1 deep dive. You and I did a deep dive on Leverkusen. Matt and I did a deep dive into all sorts of politics in German football at the moment. So yeah, check that out on the Substack. And then you did a great article on what would have been if Kevin De Bruyne had opted to join Borussia Dortmund back in the day. I thought it was a great read. I got to edit it yesterday and I thought it was a great read. So absolutely give that a read. And yeah, we'll be back next week. Enjoy the football. Until next time, auf Wiedersehen.